Good evening, everybody. Psalm 69, verse 20 says, "Reproach has broken my heart, and I am full of heaviness. I looked for someone to take pity, but there was none, and found comforters, but I found none." I'm going to paraphrase that. The mocking has broken my heart, and I feel sick. I looked for anyone to have pity on me, and there was no one. I looked for some comfort, and I was completely alone. I wanted to start with Psalm 22 and Psalm 69, verse 20, because although our topic is maybe softened, it's a very important and incredibly sombering topic of a much more serious problem. Loneliness in a large ecclesia isn't just loneliness in the hall. It's not just loneliness at ecclesial events. It is the fact that we are part of a larger community and yet we still feel alone. So the way we're going to go through this is we're going to look at why loneliness happens, like what it is and the reasons behind it, and more from a clinical perspective for a second. I want to briefly look at solutions that we can collectively, as a group, go through to limit the impact of loneliness. And then for the bulk and the remainder, I want to look at a very specific message to each of us. Loneliness is more than about feeling physically alone. Loneliness is a state of mind that makes us feel detached or isolated, unwanted, even when surrounded by people. This state of mind creates feelings of shame. It makes us feel misunderstood and disconnected. In order to avoid these feelings, we end up avoiding human contact. We detach ourselves from the pain caused by those unpleasant interactions. But what really causes the pain isn't the interaction with others. The pain is caused by our own thoughts and feelings about those interactions. And all this combined creates a degenerative cycle where we can feel increasingly disconnected from others. It gets harder and harder to be vulnerable and to reach out to others. Some of the reasons that people feel alone in our ecclesia or in life in general is because primarily they don't feel safe enough to connect with others. Our ecclesias can actually make walls without realizing it. We can make walls by groups that form either intentionally or unintentionally. A grieving person feels alone, even in a crowd. Sometimes those with smiles are the loneliest people. They're just covering it up. Some people are not extroverts, but they still need connection. People that are new, of which we have many, feel like they stick out. Sometimes the ones that you would expect not to be lonely at all are the most lonely. Whatever the reason, the grief and the impact of it is very real. We all want to belong to something. Loneliness in and of itself has been connected with a wide range of health conditions. Depression, high blood pressure, dementia. It makes us more likely to rely on substances, whether smoking or drinking to excess. It causes us to neglect healthy eating, and exercising, and all this has obvious negative impacts on our health. And those that should be in the prime of their life, more than a third of them, aged between 18 and 34, struggle with feelings of isolation in their life. Our brains are social. The power of social isolation has a very negative impact on our brains. The region of the brain that's activated when we experience rejection or loneliness is the same region that's affected when you step on a piece of Lego on the floor. It hurts. The pain compounds into a physical sickness, which isn't cured with medication. In other words, both soft and hard sciences agree we are relational human beings. We are designed to connect with one another. Not merely connect with individuals, but connect as interdependent persons in a community. Inside our Ecclesia, we have a wide range of personalities, preferences, interests, insecurities, knowledge levels, cliques. And what these do is they isolate, insulate, and divide just instinctively. Just because someone is single doesn't mean they're the only ones that are alone. Couples themselves can feel alone. A new couple to our Ecclesia may feel left out or out of place. Couples that have been here for a while may have different preferences, choices, parenting styles, and don't fall into a family group or have a similar career or common ground that they settle on. Maybe the elders in our Ecclesia can't move around as much as they used to be able to. Perhaps their hearing is declining and they can't interact and communicate as easy as they once would. And a key group is our single adults. Single adults in our Ecclesia, no matter the age, often feel isolated and alone, even though they seemingly have all their other single adult friends. Couples and families tend to interact and socialize together. Single people often aren't invited until they get a partner, and then they're suddenly miraculously invited, or worse, the invitations decline if someone becomes widowed or divorced. But maybe none of these apply, or maybe all of them apply. The point that I'm making is that we are built as social and relationship-needing individuals. So this is the reason why it happens. So as a group, how do we find some form of solution to it? And I guess, why is it important to find a solution to it? One of the first relationships that turned out badly, ironically, is Cain and Abel. And God's question to Cain is, where is your brother? More correctly translated would be, how is your brother? How do we foster a community that asks the question, how is my brother? If we want to grow an ecclesia that embraces everyone, how can we go about it? I've got a couple of ideas here. The first one is to treat people as individuals, not defined by their occupation, not defined by the family they belong to or their relationship status. The language we sometimes use in our ecclesias is based on sometimes based on the assumption that people are married with children, and classes and studies focus on interpersonal relationships and can focus on marriage, parenting, family life. And again, that can potentially leave out our single adults. A massive thing we have to do as a community is to remove the stigma of loneliness. Many of us, myself included, have at times experienced loneliness at the Ecclesia. It doesn't just affect single people, it doesn't just affect older people. But for some reason, there's some sort of shame associated to admitting that you feel lonely. acknowledging it publicly may make us struggle with feelings of isolation and judgment when people admit their feelings and reach out. Another idea is to extend our social engagement to all our social engagements, our invitations to all relationships and demographics, which as an ecclesia here, we do a fairly good job of. But it's something we have to consciously and intentionally continue to do. The problem with familiarity or family is that we, by default, can just gravitate to those we're most familiar with. And whether that's our friendship groups or our family units themselves. It's much easier for me if I'm having a down, negative, pessimistic day, I don't really feel like being at the meeting, to go and talk to Joachim because he's my brother-in-law, than it is to reach out and talk to someone that I haven't spoken to in a while. So we need to be mindful of others when we plan events or if we're interacting at the Ecclesia or afterwards. The teaching of Christ is devotion to one another. The world around us has a rise in a concept called Western individualism. What that means, it's just the focus on the needs of the individual rather than the needs of the group as a whole. This rise in individualism has actually sparked massive rises in social isolation. This is even before we were actually in isolation. And that's due to the way that the world around us has changed. That is not how the Bible is written. That is not the teaching of Christ. We as a family unit, as an ecclesia, have to work tirelessly to recover the biblical version of human interaction. Now, this is not easy. This is hard work. That's why Paul's letters emphasize the establishing of a healthy community, primarily through sacrificial relationships. We need to embody the call of Romans 12. Be kindly affectionate one to another with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer, and distributing the needs of the saints given to hospitality. So that's all good and fine, but how does it affect you and how does it affect me? We are relational beings. Jesus is the model of a relationship-based or a relationship-needing individual. Psalm 22 we read, Psalm 69 verse 20 that I read, demonstrates his feelings and how he felt isolated and alone. However, Jesus was never not in relationships. He spent his early years with parents and siblings. He had a normal, relatively, childhood, and his early adulthood was more or less in obscurity. He launched his ministry by inviting friends to follow him. On the eve of his crucifixion, when he would have had the right to withdraw and be, crushed or isolated, he gathered his disciples together for a meal and then led them to pray in Gethsemane. And then with his final breaths, he was still reaching out to his friends, to his disciples, to care for his mother. Now, on occasion, Jesus withdrew to pray in solitude, but again, he's praying. He's in a relationship with his Father. So if relationships are so vitally important for Jesus, then they should be something we as individuals prioritize. Simply put, we are created to be part of a community. We live in a society that emphasizes me before we. Not in a selfish way necessarily, although that is more often the case, but because we stimulate and model ourselves and build our identity based on ourselves as individuals. But weirdly, and probably not weirdly, but rather unsurprisingly, isolation and loneliness is a symptom of the individualistic society that we live in. The last 70 years has seen a huge spike in individualism. The shift in the Western world that we live in towards a more secular or non-religious based way of thinking has coincided with a rise in people being more me versus we focused. No matter how much we study the Bible or how good our relationship with God is, our minds, our perspectives are heavily influenced by the world around us. We live in the world. We can't help but to absorb some of the way of living. What this means is our communication methods, our social interactions, and the means with which we create an identity or our self-worth are at some level influenced by the world around us and how they value themselves and create an identity. My point in saying this is we need to identify the limitations that society puts on us, and by extension, what limitations we put on ourselves. And then weigh these limitations against what God has told us about what he values and what he expects of us. My dad did a class here a couple of years ago now about expectations, our expectations of God. I was talking to him recently about this class, and he reminded me of that study that he did, and some of you may remember it. If I was to ask you what are our expectations of God, we would say we want him to love us, we want him to listen to us, we want him to be with us, support us, all those sorts of things. And then if I was to say what are your expectations of life, we would say a good family, a partner, a good job, no money troubles. And then what would we say, what does God expect of us? And what God expects of us is everything that we do to others that he expects, that we expect for him to do for us. I'll say that again. So everything that we expect of God, he expects us to do for others. The solution that God has provided is so typical of our God. We help ourselves by helping others. Our instruction is to seek first the kingdom of God and everything else will be added to you. And another one is to love your neighbor. In the Western world, we tend to read the scripture from a bit of a individualistic framework. However, when we read something like the Lord's Prayer, it's plural pronouns being used. Our Father, give us, forgive us. Paul writes our Lord 53 times and my Lord only once. Our salvation isn't less than personal, it's more than personal. The gospel and the way that Jesus framed it is unrefutably relational. It's social. It's heavily relationship-based. The interactions that Jesus had and that we're taught to have with our brothers and sisters is the concept of Platonic intimacy. This is the scriptural model for friendship and the scriptural model for relationships that we're told that something like David and Jonathan's relationship modeled after. The love was stronger than that of a husband and a wife. And we have the example of Jesus laying down his life for his friends. In Ephesians 5, we're told to submit to one another. In this context, a key commandment of Christ is to confess our faults one to another. As a Western religious community, we allow a sense of judgment to become accepted practice if it becomes known that we have some sort of weakness or issue or knowledge of sinful behavior if that gets out. What this does is it cultivates an environment where issues are ignored, weaknesses are spurned, sinful behavior is either severely adjudicated or swept under the rug. The Victorian British heritage of our culture means that the foundation of our community, particularly in Canada, the US, the UK, means that emotion is something that is not accepted common practice as in other cultures. I know for me particularly, emotion makes me a little uncomfortable. However, in other cultures, it's celebrated and it's actively encouraged in some situations. Our Father wants us to take all of our challenges and our issues to Him and commands us to utilize our brothers and sisters to carry our burdens. Some of our issues of isolation or lack of friendship can only be solved through fellowship, friendship, or interacting with others. Building real, deep, emotional and spiritual connections with our brothers and sisters whereby we're able to confide in them is that action. By this, we can source help, knowing that we're not going to be judged or gossiped about. I want to give you an example about something as a tool in building relationships that Alicia actually implemented in our relationship many years ago. This is the principle of friendship as it pertains to couples. It's called the straight line versus the triangle. And what it means is my interactions with my friends and Alicia is a triangle. There's a straight line, not a triangle, rather. Even if her and I are both friends with that one person. And what that means is I'm in the middle because I am friends with both. If I'm told information by my friend, unless I'm specifically told that she knows or I'm allowed to talk to her about it, she won't know. I joke that means we don't talk, but that means that my relationships with my friends, even if they may be friends with her as well, is held in confidence because that is the straight line versus the triangle. It can't be assumed that anything you tell me, my wife always also knows, unless specifically warned about or cautioned for. Because we're told to confess our faults one to another. And men will want to communicate differently with men than they do with women, or some things may not be comfortable being discussed. We're told to confess our faults one to another, not confess other people's faults one to another. This is Platonic intimacy. From my experience, confession and confiding is an incredibly helpful and spiritually uplifting practice. We realize we're not alone and that others are just as weak and challenged as we are. We also build a relationship that becomes the foundation of an iron sharpening iron type relationship. These relationships are built on trust, mutual respect, and accountability. And the pinnacle of these relationships is the value of realizing we're all imperfect. And by that, we're actually able to grow mutually with that iron sharpening iron. And what that does is that removes the feeling of loneliness because by definition, you have common ground and commonality. So there are 4 things that we can do specifically for ourselves to at least start the process of removing a feeling of loneliness. I came from a new country to a new ecclesia, to a family I didn't really know, to an ecclesia that I'd never attended, and actively avoided doing doorkeeping for the first 3 years because when visitors came, I didn't hardly know who they were and I hardly knew who most of the ecclesia was for about the first year. Now that's on me. So I know what it's like to feel alone in an ecclesia. So The first thing and the easiest thing is to love your neighbor. Jesus didn't say be loved by your neighbor. He said love your neighbor. We're not told to worry about feeling included, but to get on with including others. We're not told to feel loved, but to get busy loving others. If we find ways to serve others, then hopefully at some point when we're feeling alone, others feel the need to serve us. Even an awkward conversation is better than no conversation. It's not about whether we have friends, it's about who we're being a friend to. Another really important one is when we get in our own heads is to actually check the facts. When we are feeling negative or isolated, our emotions can quite easily overtake our ability to think rationally. When we start to feel unsettled, we have to try not to rely on our gut and our feelings, but instead just go back to the raw, hard data. Take note of the times that we've been loved and cared for, and then look for those moments to thank God and create gratitude for what we have, and ask ourselves things like, who spoke to me at these events, who's asked me about my life recently, and are there people who are inviting me to do things with them. We also need to accept that this is not easy. Ephesians 4 verse 2 says, bear with one another in love. That is not an easy thing. That's specifically saying bear, because bearing with something is not by default easy to do. There are times when we seriously need to bear with one another. We are a family of imperfect people. There will be times when we're left out or hurt, and we need to prepare ourselves to forgive and to show grace in the same way that Christ does. And interestingly, we also need to be aware that we will hurt others. And when we do, we need to be humble and seek forgiveness. Stemming back from the days in high school, we need to realize we're not actually alone. Everyone feels lonely. Even the person we assume doesn't feel lonely. At some point, everyone feels it. There is no such thing as the in crowd, because no one actually realizes they're in it. Even when we're surrounded by amazing people, it's possible to feel insecure. The people we assume are fine and have it all together sometimes don't agree. Everyone feels lonely or disconnected or insecure occasionally. It's not just me, it's not just you, it's every single one of us. We need to realize that we're not alone in our loneliness and let others know too. We need to remind each other that these are realities that we all face, and encourage each other to love and serve each other until we wait for Christ's return. I despise the phrase in the context of loneliness or depression that God should be enough. I'm sure you've heard something to that degree. This isn't about God is enough, or just get out to the meeting and you'll be okay, or get your head in the Bible and study and you'll be okay. While a close relationship with God goes some way in alleviating the pain of loneliness, humans are created to be in relationships. And our faith doesn't simply make up for long evenings with no conversation or painful longings for a friendship or a companion. And dismissing someone's feelings by telling them God should be enough will only make them feel more inadequate, isolated, and unimportant. The only thing we can do is to guide them and guide each other to understand the expectations and to readjust our expectations of what God expects of us and what we can expect of Him. God never promised us an easy life. but our expectations have to be based on what he expects of us. His prescription is to treat others how we expect him to treat us. However, given all this, we will still have our tough days. God never promised us an easy life, but he did make us a number of promises. So on our hard days, I want to just give you nine quotes, 9 verses to lean on the hard days when it's difficult to get out of our own head. These are promises that God made to comfort during isolated and feelings of loneliness. John 14, verse 16. I will pray the Father, and he will give you a helper. He may abide with you forever, the Spirit of truth. I will not leave you orphans. I will come to you. Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Psalm 27, verse 10. When my father and mother forsake me, then the Lord will take care of me. Psalm 147, verse 3. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Isaiah 54, verse 10. For the mountains shall depart and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from you, nor shall my covenant of peace be removed, says the Lord. Psalm 18, verse 6. In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried out to my God. He heard my voice from his temple, and my cry came before him even to his ears. Isaiah 41, verse 13. For I, the Lord your God, will hold your right hand, saying to you, fear not, I will help you. Deuteronomy 31, verse 6. Be strong and of good courage, for the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Matthew 28, verse 20. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. As long as we desire for God's presence and ask for his help, there will never come a time when God will leave us to fend for ourselves.